Yeah, I think I'm going to get us started. I can see we've got quite a few participants on the line already. So good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And a very welcome from Oxford to our second Engaging with Evidence session. It's wonderful to see so many of you on the line, and thank you all so much for taking time from your busy days to join us for this discussion this afternoon. I'm Adriana Anastasio. I'm a Policy and Engagement Manager at the Government Outcomes Lab, and alongside my colleague Tanya, I'll be the host for today's session. The purpose of today's session is to explore the findings of a very recent hot off the press report that Ecorys have published very recently. It's an evaluation study into the implementation of 4 development impact bonds, 3 of them in Africa, namely Village Enterprise, the Cameroon Cataract Impact Bond, and the Icrc Humanitarian Impact Bond, and 1 project from India, Quality Education India. All these projects are supported as part of the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, who are the commissioner of the study that we're going to be discussing today. And I know some of the questions that we'll be looking at today are questions that many of you in the global community of practitioners interested in outcomes-based approaches have been asking for quite a while. What is the so-called DIB effect? What's the added value of funding services through a development impact bond? What are some of the conditions or success factor, or when is it really appropriate to fund international aid social programs to this funding mechanism, and how does it compare to grant funding or indeed other forms of payment by results? So lots of different, very complex questions. We're really privileged to have an absolutely fantastic group of speakers joining us today. So we've got representatives from FCDO joining us, we've got the authors of the report, and then we've got perspectives from all the 4 projects that the evaluation study has looked at. Before I start, if you're new to the Engaging with Evidence series, just to briefly mention, we've set this up, we've launched it this year at the beginning of the year because we wanted to create an open platform for policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to get together and have some really meaningful conversations around the latest evidence that's emerging from the field. At the Go Lab, this is obviously something that's extremely important to us, and we appreciate that often as more and more evidence is emerging, it's quite difficult to find the time to engage with the findings in a really meaningful way. And we're also keen that we don't just look at the research findings in isolation from the lived experience of the practitioners involved in the actual projects and their discussions. So we're very grateful to all the panelists who make time to join us today. Again, if you've been on Go Lab sessions before, you know that we like to keep these sessions as interactive as possible. We're all getting a bit fed up with Zoom by now, so we'll try to keep this session as dynamic as possible. Please do get involved. Both Tanya and myself will be keeping an eye on the chat. Any questions you have at any point, drop them in the chat. We'll stop at different points throughout the session to try to pick up some of the questions or comments indeed that you've asked in the chat, and we'll come to you, ask you to unmute yourselves if you want to ask your question directly. I see lots of you have your cameras on already, which is brilliant. It's always lovely to see your faces on the other side of the screen. Do keep your cameras on, but just remember to stay muted unless you're invited to contribute. We are recording the session. I know a few of you have asked whether the recording will be available after the session. Yes, it will be. You'll find all the information on the Go Lab website. And in fact, Laura, perhaps I can ask you to just drop in the chat the link to the event page, because that includes the slides from today's session as well. We've structured, if I could just quickly give you a very brief overview of today's session. We've got about 90 minutes together, and we've structured the session in 3 parts really. So in part 1, we'll invite Verdana and Charlie from FCDO to just give us all an overview of the FCDO DIB pilot program. We're assuming, I should have started with this, we're assuming that most of you, all of you on the call, have a relatively at least good understanding of the DIB mechanism itself. So we won't be spending time looking at that specifically, but we thought it'd be helpful to hear from Verdana and Charlie a bit more about the aims of the pilot program launched by FCDO, and perhaps a little bit of an update as to where the program is now. In part 2, we'll go to James Ronicle and Kay Lau at Ecorys for a discussion of the key findings from the study. We've been really harsh with them, and we said we won't give them more than 15 minutes because we want to make sure we save enough time for questions from participants and discussions on the chat. If you do have questions for them as they go through their slides, please drop them in the chat. Right after the presentation, we'll stop for a brief Q&A before we move on to the final and most substantive part of the discussion of the session, which is a panel discussion with, as I said, the really distinguished lineup of speakers. I will stop there because I'm keen that we allocate most of the time to our speakers. For any questions, any sorts of practical issues that you might have with Zoom, again, feel free to drop Tanya or myself a line on the chat directly. So without any further ado, I'll stop there and I'll invite Rodana and Charlie to first of all briefly introduce themselves and then just give us a bit of context setting, a bit of an overview of the FCDO pilot program. So over to you, Rodana, first, and then Charlie, maybe.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, Andrea. And I understand you've got our slides, right?
I do, yes.
Which
funnily enough, I thought I was already sharing my screen. Just
there you go.
I wasn't. Apologies.
No, no worries at all. Hi, everybody. My name is Rodana Krova, and I lead the impact investing team in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Charlie Bogan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charlie. I'm also at the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. I'm a senior policy advisor. I also lead on impact bond policy, and I'm managing the FCDO DIBs pilot program. Lovely to be here.
So without further ado, we can go into our very brief introduction. Thanks very much, and thank you, Andrea, for the lovely intro to us today. Thanks a heap to the GoLab team as well for hosting the seminar session. It's fantastic to be here with you all, and great to see the already high and growing number of participants. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. We're really thrilled to be here. Like I said, I lead the impact investing team here at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Our main job as a team really is to look for effective ways to enable more private finance to flow to projects that have strong sustainable development impact, mainly focusing on low and middle income countries. So our work on impact bonds has been a really prominent part of this over the last couple of years. And more importantly, a huge part of how we generate useful evidence to inform policy. So I wanted to share this very brief timeline for you to do a little bit of scene setting before I hand over to Charlie. So see, back in 2016-17, when we first set up the impact bonds pilot, then DFID had already started gathering some evidence and experience in many outcomes-based approaches, and you know, payment by results. The idea that instead of funding projects upfront, we should look for driving and paying for results and outcomes delivered. That was not a new concept by a long stretch. We'd had a fair number of examples across the portfolio, papers, case studies, do's and don'ts, as well as first evidence reviews. But somehow we were still really hesitant in models that included investors in pre-financing delivery, either through directly contracting with us or through partnering up with the service providers with whom we work. We weren't really sure how to approach these partnerships, what the contracting, what the legal implications were, any barriers. And you know, that's despite seeing a number of domestic public services using the impact bond model that were showing promising progress and really first results. Part of the reason why we set up the Impact Bonds pilot was really creating some of these first examples of impact bonds in delivery, developing that hands-on experience and making sure that we draw useful evidence out of it. And what the timeline illustrates are the different types of evidence that we're drawing from the pilot. First of all, case studies. You know, once you've started, once you've actually signed the project, first agreement templates that we can share at least internally within the organization, hopefully soon with partners as well. Very, very importantly, first results evaluations that are already coming through some of the impact bonds project. All of these are part of the evidence picture for us. But it's this piece, it's this evaluation that we will be sharing with you today that looks across projects to draw lessons across this still relatively small portfolio. That's really the centerpiece of our evidence gathering so far, and hopefully what will help us replicate and scale this programming going forward. So with that, let me hand over to Charlie Morgan now, and Charlie will take us through a little bit more of the DIBs pilot and what we're trying to learn through the evaluation. Charlie, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Rodana, for that introduction. That's super helpful. Very happy to take you through the 3 projects, at least in the DIBs pilot programme. And in case, you know, some of you may be very well aware of these projects already, but for those of you who haven't yet been introduced, I'm very happy to lead you through them quickly. So we've got 3 projects, as you can see up on the screen. We've got the Icrc Humanitarian Impact Bond, which is operating in Mali, Nigeria, and DRC. The key kind of activities that they're doing is building and setting up 3 new physical rehabilitation centres in each of those 3 countries to kind of deliver services to help people with disabilities to regain mobility. And the overall outcome of the programme will be to increase service efficiency over time. And that's being delivered by Icrc. We also have the Village Enterprise Development Impact Bond, which is operating in Kenya and Uganda. Really, really fascinating programme as well. They're working to improve the incomes of around 13,000, if not more, households living in extreme poverty in those 2 countries. And they do that predominantly by helping them to set up and run micro-enterprises through a combination of business training, mentoring, and seed transfers. And lastly, we have the Quality Education India Impact Bond, which is operating in several different states across India. The key outcomes for that is to work with 4 different types of service providers who are doing different types of intervention. They're all working in different ways to try and improve the literacy and numeracy skills of around 200,000 primary school children in India. So really, really excited for you to kind of meet the different service providers later on in the panel discussion. Also, as part of the evaluation, of course, there is the Cataract Cameroon Cataract Development Impact Bond. Kay and James will also be providing a bit more of a context as to why that project was brought on board as part of the evaluation in just a moment. So just a couple of reflections from me on where we are right now, where we are today on the project, before we move on to the findings. So I came into this role just almost a year ago, actually, and during lockdown, in fact. And I have to say it's been such an incredible experience this whole year, and seeing how the projects have unfolded for me has been a year of challenge and also a real year of resilience. It's definitely an interesting moment to have taken over the pilot kind of halfway through, but it's been really, really fascinating, and I'm so grateful to all of the people involved who've kind of helped me in my learning journey along the way. So where are we now? Things are in full swing. Icrc has recently opened 2 of their physical rehabilitation centres, and Village Enterprise has just completed their intervention and is now pending evaluation. And finally, Quality Education India is in their 3rd year of delivery. They've been demonstrating exceptional agility in adapting to ongoing school closures in India, as they have been continuing to deliver their interventions remotely. So seeing kind of very different stages across all 3 of those projects. I have to say it's been really interesting to see their journeys over the last 12 months, and not just because of the pandemic. I mean, obviously it's been fascinating to observe how the DIB model has held up against the pressures caused by the pandemic, but also it's because we're in delivery phase now. And that's a very exciting point for the programme and for this evaluation, because we're actually starting to be able to trace the impact that the model is having on how these interventions are delivering on the ground. And some of the features that we're going to talk about today have really come to the fore. For example, the kind of very strong role of internal or external performance managers, and how that's leading to a better data collection to track the achievement of outcomes throughout the project, which in itself is then leading to more adaptive management and the ability to course correct and respond with agility to disruptions. So James and Kay are really going to be talking about this in more detail, but it's just really fascinating for us to be able to see these findings coming out as delivery has been kind of being implemented across the board. So really, just to sum up, I want to hand over to James and Kay so we can get into it, get into the detail. But I think we're in a very different place to where we were at the time of the last report, which focused specifically on the design of the programs. So much more learning is coming out on those design choices and how they're impacting on the dynamics of the model. And we're just absolutely thrilled to be able to share those findings with you today. So with that, very happy to pass over to James and Kay.
That's excellent. Thanks so much, Charlie and Rodana, for that very helpful context setting piece. And Charlie, so you've already alluded to some of the interesting findings coming out of this new report. So it gives me a nice segue into inviting James and Kay into the conversation. So again, if I could just ask you to just briefly introduce yourself, although James, I feel like you're a regular on our online sessions by now. But over to you.
Great, thanks very much, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm Kay. I'm a senior research manager at Ecorys and the project manager on this evaluation. And we're just really pleased to be here today to be able to share and discuss some of the findings from the evaluation. James, did you want to introduce yourself quickly now?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm James Ronicle. I'm an associate director at Ecorys, and I lead on our our impact bond research.
Great. Is the sound a little better now? I'll speak a little closer to the mic. Great. So I guess just building on what Charlie said, the evaluation builds on 4 DIBs. So the 3 DIBs that Charlie has introduced already, and in addition, also the Cameroon Cataract Bond. So the Cameroon Cataract Bond provides quality cataract surgeries, a target of 18,000, at a low cost for middle-income patients and no cost for low-income patients. And there's also a secondary objective to support the first eye care hospital in Cameroon to reach self-sufficiency in 5 years, and also to become a training institute for the region. The key rationale for adding another DIB to the evaluation is that we thought by using the same approach and the same research tools to a 4th DIB, this would be a good chance to further enrich the findings of the evaluation and also understand how findings compared and contrasted across different contexts and with different programs. And broadly, the evaluation runs 2017 to 2022-23, so aligned to the timeline Rodana shared, and also broadly aligned to the timeframes of the DIBs themselves. And the presentation today focuses on the second research wave, which focuses mainly on the delivery of the DIBs to date. And next slide, please. Thank you. So just briefly on the evaluation approach. The key evaluation objective is to understand the advantages and disadvantages of applying a DIB model, and also how it compares to alternative funding models. So for example, grants or payment by results, results-based financing, and to try and understand what improvements can be made to increase the benefits of using the model and reduce the transaction costs. So with that in mind, the focus of the evaluation is not really on the projects per se, but more on the DIB effect. So what is the effect of using a DIB instead of an alternative funding mechanism, or what we've called the DIB effect? And we've taken an approach, a combination of process tracing and comparative analysis. And I guess practically that's involved 3 steps. So firstly, we created indicators for each DIB effect. So for example, an expected DIB effect was around strength and performance management. So we created indicators that we would expect to see. So for example, the rigor of the monitoring and evaluation system, the approach to verifying outcomes, the frequency and quality of internal and external reporting, for example. Then the second step involved comparing the DIB with a comparable project site. So I think ideally for the valuation, we would have had the exact same project not funded for a DIB to be able to compare. But this wasn't really possible. So we identified very similar projects that tended to be funded, delivered by the same provider or working in the same area, delivering similar activities into similar target outcomes to try and compare. We then tried to assess the extent to which we saw these indicators in place at the comparator site and also at the DIB site to be able to compare the DIB effect. Though, of course, I think we also recognize that just because we saw, for example, strong performance management in the DIB compared to the non-DIB, this wouldn't necessarily mean it was due to the DIB, hence the importance of step 3. So step 3 was very much us then trying to break down what the factors were that contributed to this DIB effect and assess whether it was a DIB factor or a non-DIB factor. So for example, a DIB factor contributing to performance management could be the important role of the intermediary to be supporting service providers. But equally, there were also non-DIB factors that could contribute. So for example, the quality of the providers or where the system was already introduced before the DIB. So we try to then break down DIB and non-DIB factors contributing to the effect to be able to come into an assessment about whether the change was observed and the extent to which it can be attributable to the DIB. And I think across most effects, it tended to be a mix of both DIB and non-DIB reasons. In terms of the evidence base, this was both primary and secondary data, both at the 4 DIBs and the program level. And we also had held interviews at the sector level to try and help us contextualize our findings and understand how these findings compared to other SIBs and DIBs. And I'll pass on now to James to share our key evaluation findings.
Thank you, Kay. So as Kay described, what we were really trying to understand was what is the DIB effect? What happens to these service providers and these services when they're funded through a DIB compared to other areas? And this slide really tries to distill all of that into one aspect. So what we have here on the left is kind of what is a DIB? What are the inputs that go in and that are different to other types of contracting mechanisms? We've obviously got the payment by results aspect here and funding tied to outcomes. We have a sharing of financial risk between different stakeholders, donors, service providers, and investors. And typically what a DIB also seems to bring is a broader range of stakeholders. So that's both the investors themselves, often intermediaries and performance managers and other organizations as well. What we generally saw when we compared the DIBs to the non-DIB areas was those DIB-related inputs seemed to lead to 4 changes within the projects and within delivery. And they're the sort of 4, what we've started calling the key ingredients that are there in the middle of this slide. So the first thing that we often saw in the DIB compared to the non-DIB areas was a stronger focus on outcomes right from the beginning. So much greater clarity on what exactly the core outcomes are that the service is trying to achieve. Much greater understanding of how that's being verified. So the service provider is taking a long time really understanding the verification mechanism, and throughout delivery, a greater focus on the outcomes. So sometimes what we saw either in these non-DIB areas or in other projects is the evaluation or aspect or the outcomes aspect is maybe something that happens after delivery, whereas it was really embedded at the forefront of the projects within the DIB. The second thing we saw was heightened performance management. So stronger approaches to measurement, external scrutiny and support, meaning that projects had a greater understanding of what issues were going on within the project and received support to change those during the project. The third thing that we saw the DIB brought was external perspectives and expertise. So these broader range of stakeholders that come, if you like, alongside or with a DIB, added value to the delivery of the project in terms of both thinking about the design up front, but also just having more people around the table and a wider set of skills for problem solving when things weren't going wrong, and also introducing new approaches. And then the final key difference we saw in the DIB compared to other areas was this, what often people themselves describe as a high stakes environment. So that's both the financial risk that's attached with a payment by results contract, but also what was often described as a reputational risk that came with the DIB itself. So the heightened scrutiny, the heightened interest in this mechanism, the transparency around publishing, measuring and publishing of outcomes created this high stakes environment. I think it's important to state that this was often seen as both being a positive and a negative effect. When things are going well, this high stakes environment can be very rewarding. There's a lot to celebrate. But when things are going badly, there's increased pressure, increased stress. There's almost nowhere to hide because of the increased transparency. It's really clear that things aren't performing well, and that can lower morale as well. So it's really important to bear in mind that high stakes environment has both positive and negative consequences. What do those 4 ingredients, what did they seem to achieve? Well, the largest effects we kind of saw as a consequence of the DIB was what Charlie has already alluded to, this stronger adaptive management and course correction. So a greater priority in outcomes, greater measurement of outcomes, and increased pressure to respond when those outcomes weren't being achieved meant that the DIB was often a catalyst for changing things more strongly and quickly during the project. There was sometimes, though not always, greater collaboration and partnership working between the stakeholders involved in the project because of these 4 factors as well. And there's emerging, but not conclusive, I would say, evidence that these 4 aspects and this adaptive management and collaboration appears to be leading to more outcomes being achieved in these DIBs compared to the non-DIB areas. That appears to be most strongly in the QEI and the village enterprise DIBs, where we have quite good comparable data of where these services have been delivered previously. And it looks like the DIB has achieved more outcomes than the similar programs operating in a similar way. But I think that's a very tentative conclusion at this stage, and we want to drill into that a bit more in our final stage of delivery. Andrea, if you can move the slide on, please. Thank you. It's also interesting to note that we were looking at 4 DIBs, and whilst what I've just done is summarized the DIB effect we've seen overall, we did see different elements come out in different parts, in the 4 DIBs. And we also saw different elements come out in the non-DIB areas as well. And I think this starts to increase our understanding as to when a DIB might be most applicable. I think one of the fundamental questions to ask is a DIB always necessary? And those ingredients and changes that I've just described, are they solely attributable to a DIB? Can you only achieve those through a DIB mechanism? To which I would say, from just general common sense, but also what we've seen in the evaluation, is the answer is no. And I think perhaps one of the most interesting cases we found in our evaluation was looking at the Cataract impact bond, and then a cataract hospital in a different part of Africa, so it's not directly comparable, funded through a grant with technical assistance alongside. And actually, a lot of the things that we were seeing in the DIB, those ingredients that I've just described, we also saw in the non-DIB funded area funded through a grant, which suggests that it's possible in certain circumstances, a grant with strong technical assistance alongside it can achieve very similar things to the DIB, to what we saw in the DIBs. Having said that, it's also interesting to note that the hospital funded through the DIB also saw the DIB as being key and catalytic to achieving those changes. So yes, you can get it through a DIB, through a grant, but maybe the DIB actually speeds things up as well. And like I said, we feel that that's helping us get a sense of where a DIB might be most applicable. And looking at these 4 DIBs that we've seen so far, we think there are kind of 4 areas or aspects that would mean that a DIB would be a good thing to do in this context. The first one is when you have a belief that performance could be enhanced through stronger focus on outcomes buttressed by performance management. That, as we've summarized, is the key DIB effect, really: stronger focus on outcomes, stronger performance management. If you've got a service that you think is already achieving really strong outcomes, you think that the service provider has an excellent internal performance management system, doesn't really seem to make much sense to fund it through a DIB. But if you think those things are missing, a DIB could help with that. Similar to that is where you think there is a service or a system or a culture that needs an external disruption to bring about change. The DIB was often described as a really strong sort of change management tool, a catalyst for change. And so again, if you feel that you've got an area where things could be improved, but you think there's a certain amount of stasis or things aren't necessarily changing, then a DIB could be an applicable mechanism there. The third area is where you think service providers will not be able to tolerate high levels of financial risk. some of the effects that I've just described in the previous slide could arguably also be achieved by payment by results without the external investment, but the DIB allows service providers to sort of tolerate, well, the investor takes on some of the financial risk. So again, you may do a PBR, but if you think service providers couldn't take on the risk, that's when a DIB would be most applicable. And finally, where you think providers would benefit from external expertise and support, again, that's one of the key elements that we saw within the DIB. I'll pass over to Kay to talk a little bit about some of the other lessons that we found through the evaluation.
Thanks, James. So another lesson we saw was the effect of design choices. I think building very much on what James said, the 4 DIBs did vary, and the DIB effect that we saw was not the same across the 4 DIBs. They have very different effects.
Really sorry to jump in. We're struggling to hear you just a little bit, or at least I am. I don't know whether there's any way. I mean, it looks like you're as close as you can to the microphone, but just
yeah,
you're just breaking up a little bit every.
Sorry, I'll speak a little bit slower and closer to the mic. Yeah, sorry. So just to, is that any better? Great. So yeah, building on what James mentioned, the 4 DIBs also varied a lot in terms of objectives, the DIB effects they were targeting, and the DIB effects that we saw, and they were structured quite differently as well. So some key design choices in structuring include, for example, like how financial risk is shared between different stakeholders, type of contract, how payment is determined, etc. And in the full report, we try and like map down with emerging evidence how the different design choices seem to map through to the DIB effects that James has just spoken about. So what is it about a DIB that is contributing to these different effects? And a key learning and implication is that the decision, it may not necessarily be just between whether you use a DIB or not a DIB, but what kind of DIB you need to meet your goals and how you might want to structure your DIB to meet the target objectives of using the DIB. So one example that we've set out in the table here is around the level of investor involvement, where we see 2 main camps. So for example, in Icrc and Cataract bond, the investors were reported to be most engaged during the structuring and less engaged during delivery, at least at the time of data collection. Whereas in QEI and Village Enterprise, we saw investors more closely involved throughout setup and delivery. And there seems to be a pattern or some key patterns in terms of the key design choices affecting investor involvement and the level of investor involvement. So for example, in Icrc and Cataract, we see a lower risk on investors with some measure of protection for capital. So for example, 60% and 100% on Cataract, and in Cataract with only the interest payment linked to performance. Both involved commercial investors who saw their role and added value primarily in terms of structuring the deal and providing commercial expertise. So perhaps more comparable to input you would see in a commercial transaction, and the contract between the outcome funder and service provider. And then in contrast, in QEI and Village Enterprise, you have the full risk of non-performance on the social investor. And for example, in QEI, the social investor also holding the power of veto on whether the DIB is to continue or not. And in these 2 DIBs, you saw higher involvement of investor throughout. And for example, in QEI, the investor worked quite closely with the team and with the service providers around performance management. Next slide, please. Yeah, and a third lesson then is around DIBs and COVID-19. So COVID-19 was useful to increase our understanding of the DIB effect and also how relevant DIBs are in terms of dealing with and adapting to shocks. Though noted that when we were collecting data last summer, the effects of COVID-19 weren't yet fully clear. What was emerging, though, was that DIBs can both increase and reduce flexibility in different ways. So a key advantage is that while it can help support the project to adapt quickly, so for example, by bringing together a broad range of expertise with new ideas and different expertise, by focusing on outcomes rather than inputs, so giving providers the space to focus on adapting and using, for example, shock market assessment in the case of Village Enterprise, instead of having to rework activity plans and rework budgets. And also that the DIBs themselves required strong monitoring data. So for example, Village Enterprise had put in place real-time performance dashboards, and this was also useful under COVID-19 to be able to respond more quickly. However, using a DIB can also slow things down. So renegotiating contracts took quite a lot of time, and a lot of stakeholders commented that the contracts hadn't been designed to be changed. So the fact that they had to be renegotiated required additional costs and time. DIBs also tend to involve more stakeholders, and while it was great that a more collaborative approach was taken sometimes on decision making, certain stakeholders also commented that where the process wasn't clear, where roles and responsibilities weren't clear, this could add additional time. Just two potential lessons to consider. I think the first is that changes don't always have to be through contract amendments, which can be expensive. A lot of stakeholders commented that there was little appetite to change contracts, given all the time and cost that had gone into developing the contracts in the first place. And some of the DIBs are exploring how contracts can be developed to better support adaptation, as well as using an approach to negotiate and discuss rather than triggering contractual changes. Secondly, there's an emerging learning around building in processes into governance arrangements to agree changes. So clarifying decision-making processes, roles and responsibilities, which can support DIBs to respond more quickly in times of crises. And I'll pass on to James now.
Thanks. I'm conscious that Andrea is keeping us to a tight time and we're spilling over that. So I'll just wrap up. I think what we've presented so far is what we think we know from the evaluation. So Andrea introduced those quite large questions at the beginning, and I feel like we're getting towards answering some of those, and that's what we've provided so far. However, as ever, these studies, and the minute when you start to look into these things, it also throws up as many questions as it does answers. And these are really pontifications, if you like, of things that we're sort of getting a sense of, but not so much that we could conclude on them. And if the panelists have time, I'd be really interested to hear what their opinions are on these. The first one I've sort of already answered, that is a DIB necessary to achieve the effects that we've just described? And I would say the answer is not always that payment by results or a well-designed grant with technical assistance, as we saw in some of the comparator sites, could also achieve this. But I think there are elements that we've discussed where a DIB can actually be the applicable tool that would drive these DIB effects that you may not see through other contracts. The second thing that we want to think about is what we saw with these DIBs is that they were generally, because of the reputational risk that we've described, and these were the first DIBs, they were with interventions that had a good evidence base. Some had randomized control trials behind them, and pre-selected service providers who people were confident would be able to operate in this adaptive management way. So to what extent is the DIB really substantially changing things, or to what degree is it just bringing out things that were already there? And that then has consequences for, well, I would say it's possibly dangerous to assume that you will always see this DIB effect, that if you roll these DIBs out into many areas, you will always see them. I think there are certain contextual factors in these DIBs that meant that you saw these benefits that you may not see elsewhere, but we don't know. The third one is around what you do once you've done a DIB. And one thing I forgot to say earlier is we have seen, particularly, it'd be really interesting to hear Village Enterprise and the QEI service providers, but what we saw was good spillover effects in terms of those changes we saw in the DIB then being applied and rolled out to other aspects of the organization. Does that mean that a DIB is a one-time pivot? Once an organization has done a DIB, do you need to do another? Or can you just fund this through a grant and then expect to see the same effects? We still don't know. The final one is what we saw is that a DIB takes a huge amount of energy and focus within the organization, to a degree at the expense of other things going on in that organization. So one thing that'd be really interesting to look at, which we haven't been able to do yet, is to what degree is the DIB achieving more performance and achieving more outcomes, or to what degree is it sucking energy and resources from other parts of an organization at the expense of outcomes in other areas? So is it just concentrating effort and outcomes into the DIB, or so it's displacing, or is it adding value? We don't know that, but I think that's a really interesting thing to consider. And the final one, I've seen comments in the chat around the value for money, and what we've talked about here really is the benefits. But of course, all of these benefits really come with additional costs as well. And the aspect, as well as the investor returns, the aspect that had the highest level of cost was the external performance management. And I think, but at the same time, that was one of the additional benefits as well. But there's a question, and it's just a question, as to how sustainable that is. And over time, do you always need this high cost performance management, or is there a way that you can phase that out over time? We've seen some DIBs have this quite a lot at the beginning, and then over time try and upskill the service providers and back off so that that performance management cost goes down. And I think thinking about sustainability and affordability of these mechanisms, that I think is a really interesting approach. So I'll stop there. That hopefully gives you some answers, but also some food for thought as well.
I was like more questions than answers, James, but thank you to you and Kay for such a rich range of insights, and it's fascinating to read the comments in the questions in the chat as well. So I did promise an interactive session, and we're just ever so slightly over time, but I think it was, you know, well worth allowing you to go over your allocated time. So I noticed on the chat that Laura asked a couple of questions. So Laura, perhaps I could bring you into the discussion if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself.
Sure. My question was in relation to, if you did a comparison, you compared these DIBs to standard grants, and did you also compare the investment that was done in monitoring and evaluation? So is there a possibility perhaps that some of the differences we see in the results is actually due to a difference in emphasis on measurement?
Okay, can I ask, are you able to answer that? Would you be able to do that?
Yes, sorry. On the second question around measurement, I think this varies across the 4 DIBs. So on Village Enterprise, for example, I think there was a similar approach, like an RCT used also in previous grant-funded projects. And across all projects, I think we were comparing primarily to similar grant-funded projects delivered by the same service provider. But I think I might have missed the first question.
So the question was in comparing the resources allocated to measurement and whether you'd have the same level of rigor and investment in measurement between grants and the DIB.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And under the value for money section, we try and break down the different additional costs and additional benefits. So very much we did see across a lot of the DIBs additional focus and additional like investment into monitoring and evaluation, performance management, adaptive management, which probably, you know, is a key contributor to additional focus on outcomes.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kate. James, is there anything else you'd like to add on this point around sort of identifying, singling out the PSIB effect? Again, I saw in the chat a couple of other questions around how would you go about understanding how a DIB project or a project funded under a DIB mechanism compared to other ways of funding a service?
Sorry, Andrea, what do you mean?
Do you want to just elaborate a bit more on the kind of methodology, for example, that you've in the research itself, kind of how did you go about answering this question? It's obviously something that we spend a lot of time talking about at the Go Lab, so it's something really important.
I mean, I think the simple answer is it's not easy. It wasn't easy, and it never is. I feel, if I may say so, quite proud of what we did in the DIBs project, because we've done this for a number of years, and I've said this before on your webinars, that I feel that I've never seen something that invokes such a strong reaction as an impact bond, both positive and negative. So you've got absolute proponents who I think overclaim what an impact bond is achieving in a project. Everything in a project is due to the impact bond, which I just don't think it is. You also have people who almost find it offensive, the idea that a funding mechanism will change delivery. And the reason why delivery is good is because you've got good service providers and it's nothing to do with the impact bond. And before we adopted this kind of comparator approach, trying to cut through those noises of people, I think, overclaiming and other people not wanting to attribute anything to the impact bond, how do you cut through those? And so this is why we introduce these comparator sites. So what we have is in effect a DIB theory of change. So this is both looking at literature so far on what the claimed positive and negative DIB effects are, but also doing theory of change workshops with each of the projects to sort of say, why are you doing a DIB? What do you expect to see? So we kind of create a list of indicators that you would, if the DIB worked, you would, or didn't work, in fact, you would see. So great, as we said, greater collaboration, greater outcomes than previously, possibly cherry picking, parking, other aspects as well. And then we go into the DIB with these sort of things and we look for them. So do these exist? And also then through workshops with people on the ground and discussing, okay, if they exist, why are they there? And is that because of the DIB mechanism, or is that because of other factors as well? And then we identify a comparator site that's funded through a grant. So in some of these, they were very comparable, like Village Enterprise. 30% of the intervention is a DIB, 70% is a grant. So we were doing research in the grant aspect and looking at the same things. So tell me about your collaboration, tell me about your performance management processes, how effective are they, and what is driving those changes? And then you do what's called sort of validation, verification workshops to kind of look at, well, we think we're seeing a difference in the DIB compared to the non-DIB, and we think it's because of the DIB, but also because of X and Y. And then it's kind of working with the people on the ground to kind of work out whether that's agreed or not. So it's a very theory-based qualitative approach, but I think be very interested in other people's reflections. I think it's the closest you can get to be able to answer this question.
Excellent. Thanks so much, James. So I see some of our guest speakers are already sharing their insights on the chat. So I think this reminds me that it's perhaps time that we move on to the panel discussion. So Tanya, over to you now.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrea. Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us for the session. My name is Tanya Hamid, and I'm a research and policy associate at the CoLab. My current work is very much around evaluating impact bonds in the UK and disseminating our research works. I'm really excited to be here with you today and to be learning more about DIBs across Asia and Africa. For the next part of our session, we'll be moving on to our panel discussion. We will build on the findings that Kay and James very helpfully shared. We're lucky to have with us today experts and practitioners from each of the 4 DIBs covered in the report. It'll be great to learn a bit more about their experiences on the ground and to hear if the findings of the report resonate with them. The discussion structured around 3 core themes. So firstly, we'll be discussing the 4 key ingredients in a DIB, the conditions in which DIB is most appropriate, and then finally, some lessons learned from DIB application, including adaptation to COVID-19. And as Andrea said before, please do keep dropping any questions and comments into the chat, and I will check back on these very shortly. So to kick off with our very first core theme, I'd like to come to our panelists one by one. And it would be great if you could please give a quick introduction of yourself and your project, and in particular discuss the rationale for using a DIB model. So why were these projects structured as DIBs rather than grants or other traditional commissioning mechanisms? And more generally, do the findings of the report resonate with you? So if I could come to you first, Tadeo, and then I'll come to Juan, Joe, and then Aaron. So over to you, Tadeo.
Thank you, Tanya. Yes, my name is Tadeo Morioki, and I'm working for Village Enterprise here, based here in Kenya, but obviously overseeing both our countries of operation, Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. Yeah, so thanks for having us here. We really, I really appreciate that. So for us, we wanted to, the way we went into DIB, DIB had never been tried in the poverty alleviation space. So we really thought this would be an exciting project for us. So, we wanted to test the effectiveness of DIB to see whether DIB would be a model that we could be able to deploy at a grander scale. We also wanted to get the opportunity of using DIB as a way of testing DIB as a way of seeing whether we can attract new funders and impact investors, because one of our really big goals in the next few years is to scale our program. So a way of thinking about how to get more funding through new funders and impact investors. And then the other thing about DIB that also was interest for us is really rallying around a time-bound goal that would help us really focus on achieving outcomes in terms of, we know we have to achieve outcomes within a limited period of time. So really focusing on that and hopefully, rallying around everybody on, a well-defined goal, and that would really hopefully lead to better outcomes. So pretty much, as I think a lot of the previous speakers have said, talked about our DIB, we've already finished the implementation phase, so we're just waiting for the evaluation. It's been slowed down because of COVID, but I think now we are hopefully we'll have the evaluation done in the next few months. The DIB has been we implemented it in Kenya, rural Kenya, and in Western Kenya, and also in Eastern Uganda, in the rural parts of that. We trained over 13 new entrepreneurs. We helped them start about 4,600 small businesses, and also helped them form about 460 savings groups. And we hope by doing that, we're going to impact over 90,000 lives. Over to you, Tanya.
Thanks so much. If I could come to you, Juan.
Hang on. All right. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Thanks. All right. So my name is Juan Coderque. I've been with the Icrc for many years, going on almost a quarter of a century. I've been in charge of the new financing models unit over the past 3 years. So maybe just a quick introduction on the Icrc Humanitarian Impact Bond. It is, the first humanitarian impact bond. We did want to underline that this was taking place in more fragile settings. So in this case, Mali, Nigeria, and DRC. As it has been explained before, the main objectives of the impact bond is about building 3 new centers, but I think that it's very, very, very important to underline that the key performance indicators, when it comes to the humanitarian impact bond, is about the productivity measures that we want these 3 new centers to have, in comparison to a baseline we took in 8 other centers in 2016, and this is at the heart of the humanitarian impact bond. Maybe just to, do you want me to elaborate now a little bit on the rationale for the impact bond, or do you want me to do that later?
Yes, please go ahead. That'd be great.
Okay, and well, I'll do so in a very candid way. When the Icrc started thinking about innovative finance and the and about the impact bond, it was first of all about bringing in more money, diversifying income. One thing that we have clearly learned is that innovative finance, including impact bonds, is about, first of all, it's about new ways of working. And yes, it's about diversifying income and new ways of financing. But you're not going to get, in our perspective, new financing if you don't have a different value proposition to the traditional value proposition. So at the heart of impact bonds, again, in our perspective, and at the heart of innovative finance more generally, is new ways of working. When I mean new ways of working, I'm referring to, and again, do remember that we are a humanitarian actor, and the humanitarian actors tend to work in annual cycles. So there's a series of elements about these new ways of working that include long-term projects, partnerships, efficiency measures, innovation, much more outcomes focus, more sustainable humanitarian impact, etc. So, well, we started this process by saying, all right, let's diversify our income. So what we have learned and are very proud of that is that impact bonds, and again, innovative finance more generally, are about enabling new ways of working and about bringing into humanitarian settings actors that traditionally would not go into humanitarian settings. And I'm speaking particularly here about development actors, about private actors, about philanthropic actors and foundations, and the like. And maybe just another point that I would like to underline around the rationale. I'll stop with that. is that, again, when we started, again, the starting point was, okay, let's explore innovative finance. And then someone said, okay, let's do an impact bond. And we said, okay. So we had a solution we didn't fully understand, and then we went looking for a problem. Of course, we identified the right problem to address in collaboration with the partners that supported us. But very, very importantly, and this is another major takeaway in terms of rationale, is that when you're looking at innovative finance, impact bonds, and other mechanisms, is you have to start with the problem that you're trying to solve, as I think the evaluation clearly identifies. That is the starting point. What is the point you're trying to solve, and why does it require an innovative financing mechanism, and in this case, an impact bond? Over.
Great, thank you so much, Ron. Super helpful. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Tanya. So my name is Joe DeSilvio. I'm here with Volta Capital. We are the intermediary bond manager for the Cameroon Cataract Impact Bond. And we were involved in the design, structuring, kind of launch of the whole bond from even before launch, and now are doing the performance management and bond manager role now that it has gone to launch. We're in year 3 now. And I know you got a little bit of a background earlier in the presentation, and you can see some of the key details here, but just as a bit of background on what the Cameroon Cataract Bond is all about is essentially there's 4 key metrics we're looking at. Surgical volume of cataract surgeries in Cameroon, but also that those reach a certain quality as measured by the WHO. And also really importantly, reaching financial sustainability by the end of year 5. So having this hospital be one that is financially sustainable and can continue on after the bond is done, while also having another target around equity, so reach the bottom 2 quintiles. So kind of this balance between financial sustainability and reaching poorer segments of the population. Like I said, we're currently in year 3. There are outcome payments linked to targets in year 3 and year 5, and we're on track for those in year 3 in spite of COVID. Happy to get into details of that later. But that's just a bit of an overview of what the Cameroon Cataract Bond is all about and where we are. I think in terms of why a development impact bond, a couple of things to say here. And I think what Tadeo and Juan have said really resonates, I think, from our experience as well. I think, and what James mentioned before too, that an impact bond, as this hospital is getting set up, they needed to figure out another way to get funding to get to launch phase and to get operational. Now it's possible that could have been done through a traditional loan. I think you can make that argument, but there was 2 things here. One was investors typically found this environment too risky. So it was very difficult to find an investor that would just give a straight loan to a hospital, brand new opening up in Cameroon, given the context. So there was a bit of a rationale there for this risk sharing piece that an impact bond brings. But more importantly, the hospital also, in addition to trying out this model in a new context, trying to achieve something new and create this regional center of excellence, they wanted to also try to do something innovative in terms of the financing mechanism. And they saw this as a way of really catalyzing the performance management and the accountability that was necessary to successfully launch a hospital in this context, and for it to reach that sustainability point pretty quickly by year 5. So those are a couple of the rationales for DIB. I think in terms of the findings, they really resonate with us. I think there's a lot we can say about that will come out in the conversation. And tons I've already seen in the chat here coming up. So happy to dig into all those questions as we go. But I think from our experience, just really the 2 of the things that really stand out are this kind of what Juan mentioned, sorry, about different new kinds of stakeholders coming into a space and like crowding in new types of finance and ideas in like the eye care sector in this case is something that I think is a big value out of the impact bond, as well as this kind of real focus on results and high accountability that comes with that we've seen upside to that, and I would argue not too much downside yet from our perspective. So happy to, I look forward to the conversation, happy to dig into any of these questions more, but I'll pause there for now.
Thanks so much, Joe. I could come to you next, Aaron.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you for having me here. I think it's a great opportunity to hear everybody and the perspective of DIB and how it's being operated in different fields, different sectors. So I've been part of the Kaivalya Education Foundation, which is one of the service provider of the QEI of in India, and have been Kaivalya Education Foundation have been working in the space of education for the last 14 years in India, and we have been working in school leadership program, which basically building up a capacity to government schools, and especially the stakeholders are the headmasters and teachers, and bringing out their capacity, and which directly creates a surge in the learning of the children in the classroom. So it's a sort of an indirect way of bringing change, and so therefore it is also sustainable and replicable. So that's the program that we've been doing for the last 14 years. We have a very well-known youth mobilization program known as the Gandhi Fellowship. And Gandhi Fellow is part of this whole movement, who are youths from coming from various universities and joining this 2 years residential course, and they are the one who implements this program on the ground. So having said that, as an organization, DIB has been has it come as an opportunity to Kaivalya, and along with 3 more service providers in India. And we took this as a challenge to bring show that the concept, the theory of change for Kaivalya really works well in a more structured and time-bound manner. So that was the challenge, and Kaivalya has been very successful in adopting the systems of DIB, which was very close monitoring and scrutinizing on every level, every steps. So there is flexibility of proving or working on our theory of the concept. The theory of change is not tampered with, but the processes are well monitored. And in the year 1 itself, we achieved 6 times the target. So that gave us a lot of confidence that a program which is monitored well and planned well gives a better return. And this rationale of getting into DIB, which is getting back a return on investment for the investors or for the philanthropist, is what the concept which has excited us, because one is that you are incentivized when you're doing a program and bringing in outcome, and that is something which is very rare in the social sector. And number 2, every penny that we bring in is reharvested into the system, where we can impact larger and more schools, more children gets impacted. So that's where we come, and DIB has really brought in that dimensions in the organizations, that to get into more structured setups, and especially when government is one of your important stakeholder. It is very, very difficult to bring or align the government agencies to get into your work format. So while DIB has helped us to get into that structure, and from the very beginning of the program, government agencies, which is a major stakeholder, since we've been working only in government schools, for marginal students, large marginal students come at the government schools only, and to give them the support, government's collaboration with us have been very, very supportive, and they see the process that helped us to continue the program has given a lot of incentives to the to government to say that to accept and to own the program from the very beginning. So government stakeholders aligning with them and getting incentivized on what we are doing is something that overall excites us and is making DIB an important project in India.
Great, thanks so much, Aaron, and thanks everyone for this really helpful overview and for sharing some of the rationales behind starting these projects as DIBs. To zoom in a bit more on the service delivery aspects, again, if I could come to you, Tadeo and Arun, you already mentioned some of these things, but are there features of the DIB that have affected service delivery in your projects? These could be both positives and negatives. For example, have DIBs led to potentially better outcomes or improved service delivery in your opinion, or any other sort of challenges that you have faced so far? So if I could come to you first, Tadeo, and then Arun.
Yeah, so I think, Tanya, for right now, it's a bit too early to tell about the outcomes. We still have not been evaluated yet, but we do feel quite optimistic that DIB has really been a game changer for us. I think the fact that we tying payment to impact, and more so having the flexibility to adjust our implementation in terms of so coming up with like innovations as we go, and learning by doing, I really think really has helped us in terms of just in how we were implementing before. It's really different from the traditional one, the grant, where we were more focused on, not saying that that's not important, but more focused on like the number of businesses, the number of trainings, the number of grants, but really this having a unified goal. And one thing I've seen, and I still continue seeing even post finishing our implementation, people are really finding connection with what they're doing. They're really thinking, why am I doing this? Why am I, at the end of the day, how is it contributing to the end game, right? So previously, I think we were more engaged, like, and just as a lot of us, running activities, really not thinking about it. But even for, the most, I would say, the frontline staff down at the community level, at the village level, they really are connecting with what our program is. And I've seen that really even now past DIB, and even going back to our traditional grant model, that mindset is still there. So I do think that has really been a game changer for us. Do you want me to just talk about the positive and then I talk the negative later, or do you want me to talk about the negative as well?
Sure, if you want to go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I think for the negative, I don't think it's mostly to do with the DIB. I think it's because our DIB we used the RCT to validate impact. So with our randomized control process, there are theories to that. It added to more costs in terms of we had to get more villages. We ended up expanding to maybe areas where we had not planned to do so previously. So that added additional cost to that, and then also just other complexities in terms of even our field team really. And I think that's more because having that connection with what we do in poverty alleviation, and a lot of our field frontline staff being raised in poverty and not working in a village until we saturated, and because of the RCT, and that was really hard on them. And it took a lot of talking and just helping them understand why we were doing this. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you. Any quick thoughts from you, Arun? Arun, sorry, if I could come to you. Did you have anything to add to that? I know you already mentioned some of the effects on QAI, but if you wanted to mention anything else?
Yes, yeah, Tanya. I think DIB has been largely very effective since it's very structured and it is outcome driven. I think these are the two very important components, especially in the QEI, that has come out very clearly. And it builds a sense of accountability across all stakeholders. And when, as I initially said, that government stakeholders who are our direct beneficiaries or where we are working with, if they are motivated and they are also stands accountable to what they're doing, I think that is the positive aspect of it. And a larger objective is students' learning outcome. How do we work together, build up our capacity, and transform the classrooms into productivity? And therefore, the child is able to pick up and learn the age-specific learning. And while we do this, it is while very structured, as I said, is because it is also very time-bound. So within certain time levels, we are committed to give certain or achieve certain milestones. And the milestones needs to be further create a micro milestones to create a low beam and a high beam activity. So these are the ways that we proceed. And while we do that, that sometimes creates stress on the team, and because every school and every location that we work differs from one another, and they have diverse challenges. And these schools, as I said, students come from very marginalized background. Most of them are first generation school comers, and therefore, the challenges are very different. Community practices and language, mother tongue, everything is very complex, and therefore to catch up with the program and to mitigate these challenges on different schools, sometimes it becomes stressful for the team to maintain the timelines. So there is a positive side, and every positive side, there is some negativity. But that's the challenge that we are going through. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful. Thank you both. If I could come to you next, Joe, what do you think is the role of intermediaries and performance management in DIBs?
Thanks, Tanya. So I'm obviously a little bit biased here as an intermediary myself, but I'd love to hear other people's perspectives on this. And I think there was some interesting points on this that came out in the report so far, and some questions that I think we can discuss. But I think just generally, obviously, all these DIBs are different. So I guess the intermediary's role kind of depends on what is needed by the coalition. And we play this role in more than one impact bond, which we can discuss a little later. And so we have, but our own experiences on this, which I can talk to. I think in terms of pre-launch, there's a lot of different things that I think is unique to intermediaries that I'm sure we've all had experience with in terms of the structuring, the fundraising, coalition building, governance, and getting it to launch, that I think is solidly, for the most part, in the intermediaries camp, at least in our experience. And then post-launch, in terms of the bond management piece, we do a couple key things that I think, at least in the Cataract bond and the other bonds we've worked on, are quite important. One of which is just this stakeholder coordination, stakeholder management, given all the different types of players involved in these and the kind of different incentives and different backgrounds. We found that's quite important to have somebody in the middle that's relatively neutral, like an intermediary like ourselves, to bring everyone together, handle the reporting, and handle the kind of problem solving that comes as part of that as well. I think looped into that is this performance management piece. And I think this, I think just to preempt some questions that might come up about the intermediary role, and that came out in the report, like one of which is, do we need an intermediary, right? Can some of this be, can we lower this role to save money? Because this does add to cost, right? That you wouldn't have in a traditional grant program. I think the point I would make is that someone has to do this work, right? And so whether it's an intermediary or somebody else in the coalition that's capable of doing that, that's fine and that works. But it's still a cost. It's going to require an additional level of effort, regardless of who does it. So I think that's, and to give you an example from the Cataract bond, I saw a question in the chat just now from Eric. I'll respond to you, Eric Monroe from SIF, with more detail on that. But he asked about the equity tool, for example, which is what we use to measure, the hospital's reach to patients in the bottom 2 quintiles. And on that, for example, that's quite a tricky one, because there's all these questions about how do we measure that accurately? How accurate is this tool? How much payment do we tie to that? And so at the initial stage, there's a lot of discussion around that, but also as the bond's been rolled out. And just to answer Eric's question, we haven't actually had any payments linked to that yet. So there's ongoing problem solving discussions around that. A lot of that's been led by the intermediary in our case. So that's a few of the things we do on our bond and some of the other bonds. Also, of course, all the financial management type of stuff in terms of the outcome payment model and things like that. But I'll pause there and happy to take any questions later.
Great, thanks so much, Joe, and thanks so much, everyone. I think there's some really helpful insights and key ingredients for a DIB, but also how these practically manifest in project delivery. Next, I'd like to talk a bit more about the conditions in which a DIB is most appropriate compared to particularly other traditional forms of delivering these projects, such as grants or payment by results. So if I could turn to you, Elle, actually, and I realize we haven't actually had an introduction from you, so if you could perhaps introduce yourself and then also speak a bit more about when you think an impact bond is most appropriate. So do the rationales behind using these DIBs that we heard about from the others, do they resonate with GoLab's work elsewhere on impact bonds?
Thanks, Tanya. So my name's Eleanor Carter. I'm Research Director at the Government Outcomes Lab. And as a research team, we aim to conduct research on outcomes-based contracting and commissioning, including impact bonds. So we really work to develop data and insights to support those who are experimenting with these outcomes-based approaches. And what I found really helpful, both in this evaluation and in the contributions from the panelists, is that we can see how each project has its own sort of distinct theory of change or its own distinctive justification and pathway by which it aims to achieve change and aims to improve impact and outcomes. And I think it's really helpful to be explicit that actually each project has its own justification. And I think that makes asking and answering this question about when is this an appropriate tool quite tricky, because they're quite flexible. What is an impact bond is itself very fluid and malleable, and so they can fit in a range of different contexts, I think. Well, certainly that's what we've seen so far. So I think we need to acknowledge this variation and also be quite sensitive when we're drawing comparisons between one impact bond and another, because they might be intended to do different things and might be sort of working very differently and operating in different ways. Nonetheless, I think that the sort of key ingredients that this report spells out give us some helpful hints in terms of when this tool might be appropriate. So thinking about those ingredients in terms of whether an outcomes focus is a valuable additional contribution to a service, thinking about this boosted attention to performance management, this coming together of expertise and a high stakes environment, sort of give us some clues as to when this might be viable. I think also there's no fixed checklist, but there are some sort of fundamentals that we can think through. If we think about what is an impact bond, I think crudely it's an outcomes contract with an independent investor. And so we can think about the relevance of both of those pieces to respond to particular issues. So we might think about an outcomes contract being relevant when there's a well understood policy challenge. So we need a good understanding of the issue. Maybe there's a group of people for whom outcomes are not so great, and there's an ambition to improve that. And you've got to have someone who's happy to pay for those outcomes. We also need quite good alignment, I think, between the payable outcomes and the policy objective. So those really meaningful outcome measures, both that they're measurable and that they're acceptable to everyone involved in the project and to the people using the services. And then we've got some sort of market type conditions that I think we might need to think about in terms of when are these things appropriate. So we need to have someone who's willing to pay for outcomes. If we're calling this an impact bond, probably there needs to be an investor who's willing to step into the mix. And we've got to have some providers who are really up for this, happy to work in this new way. And you know, it's really the players around these projects that have got to be the crucial preconditions, I think.
Fantastic, that's really helpful, Elle, thank you. If I could come to you next one and turn a little bit more to the financial aspect of things again. I know you already talked a bit about the innovative financing landscape, and I see that we also have a question from Laura Houston around some of this. So how do you think some of this manifests in fragile context, but also do you think there's a scenario where these DIBs can be, or these projects can be funded purely by DIBs with no other sources of funding? Or do you think another source of funding is needed alongside?
Okay, thanks. Now, perhaps when it comes to you know, for the first part of the question, implications for more fragile or humanitarian contexts, I think I'll you know, I'll quote our friends from Munich Re, who, as you know, are. I mean, Munich Re is the #1 reinsurance company in the world, and they were, you know, one of the key players for us in the design of the humanitarian impact bond, but also, you know, they are the main investors in our humanitarian impact bond. There were other players, and what I want to underline as well, and if I have the chance, just elaborate a little bit on it, is that the impact bond changed the nature of a number of partnerships we had, and brought a few other partnerships that we didn't have. So that's also a very, very important point for us. But coming back to what I was about to say about the impact bond in a fragile setting, what Munich Re likes to say is that for them, the fact that the settings are more fragile than others is not so important. What's important is the partner, in this case the Icrc. Second, the availability of data. Third, the track record, in this case particularly of the Icrc and the program we've been implementing for 4 decades, this physical rehabilitation for war amputees. And finally, the overall quality of the project. Yeah, so I think this is very important point. Now, that doesn't apply to all investors. Yeah, but it did apply to Munich Re and Lombard Odier, which is a Swiss bank that has been around for over 200 years. They also supported us, and also I think in a good way for these reasons. Again, it's the partner, the data, the track record, and the quality of the project. Now, when it comes to the other question, can a project be funded exclusively? An organization funded exclusively by an impact bond, I think that may be a bit difficult. And even for a project, another thing that needs to be taken into account is that if you want to be active in this field, you need to invest. Yeah. We were able to do the impact bond for a number of reasons. One, because we the Icrc is a very serious organization, and when we say okay, we're going to do this, so we do it. But let's be clear, we also had a lot of support from external players. I can think also of a gentleman called Martin Toe, an Australian banker who worked pro bono with us, without whom it would have been very difficult to do this. Of course, we engaged with Cois Invest for this project, or also the Dutch government provided a grant for us to design the mechanism. And one of the lessons we have learned, and again, I'm also happy to share more about this when we come to the Q&A, is that there's a whole series of aspects around organizational readiness that are of the essence for an organization to be active in this space. Having said that, there's also another way to be active in impact bonds, innovative finance, which is to teaming up with others. Yeah, and bringing in your own comparative advantage. We always tend to speak about the things that work, but I will also mention here one thing that didn't work, is that a couple of, actually a year and a half ago or so, we worked, for quite some time to do an access to education impact bond in one of our largest operations in Africa, pretty fragile context. And we were teaming up with Save the Children. There was also strong potential with WFP for the school feeding side of things, but at the end of the day, we couldn't do it because it was too much innovation for the Icrc. But what I'm just indicating here is that if you are an organization with a specific value add and comparative advantage, you can also team up with others, to embark in this kind of adventure. What we did with Save the Children, again, for this project that didn't work, again, not because of Save the Children, but because of us, went also in this direction. Over.
Great, thank you, Juan. Just having a look at our chat, and we have some questions coming in, and people have been very good at responding to them there. But I saw a question from Emily, and I was wondering if you wanted to unmute yourself and perhaps go ahead and ask the panel around sustainability and bringing domestic governments in.
Sure. Thanks, Tanya. Thanks, everybody. Really great discussion. Yeah, and I really liked especially the questions at the end. Always good to have more questions than answers. Lots of questions we still need to try to answer. So what I noted in the chat was that all of these are DIBs, and that and so of course none of the outcome funders are domestic government, and so wondering kind of thoughts from the panel on, how does that come into play in terms of sustainability, but also I think it's an interesting question to think about, kind of what's the motivation and also of the different actors, and what are the potential, what's the sustainability, what are potential impacts of this, not just on outcomes, but in terms of kind of what we call the ecosystem effects. And that's one question. And since I have the mic, I'll raise another point. I think that this discussion about sort of that Elle raised, as well as that there may be different goals within each impact bond. And so when we started our research in 2014, we asked all of the stakeholders, why did you get involved in this impact bond? What problem were you trying to solve, or why were you engaged? And I think that it's kind of, so we had sort of a list of potential answers to that question. And so I guess my question is, do we test impact bond? Do we test each impact bond for their stated goals, or do we test each impact bond for what sort of the expectations are, what we might think in terms of this theory of change that was presented at the beginning? And so I just want to put that out there as kind of a question to all of us. But yeah, on the first question, I wonder if Joe might have some insights, given that Volta has been engaged in both SIB and DIB. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. Is it okay if I just jump in, Tanya?
Yes, please do. Please
okay. Thanks, Emily, for that. So yeah, lots to say. I know we're getting short on time and all of that. But I think it's a lot of good questions in there, Emily. But I think just for context, so we are bond manager, the same role as on the Cameroon Cataract bond, on another bond in South Africa called the Impact Bond Innovation Fund. Actually, just wrapped up at the end of last year after 3 years of implementation, which is focused on early childhood development. And I think there it was quite a different, interesting experience having the government involved for a couple of reasons. But I think one thing to highlight that connects back to a point made earlier by James, I believe, about all these projects having selected a very capable service provider to carry them out, and would have happened anyway just by having a good service provider involved. So on IBIF in South Africa, because we had government as one of the outcome funders, they explicitly mandated that we had to select as an implementer one of a local provider who had been already funded by the government in the past, and there was an explicit capacity building mandate involved. And so actually it changed everything about how we did this. So as intermediaries, it was us plus another NGO called Mothers to Mothers, which is active across sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, to do a whole capacity building piece. We built an M&E system. We helped them set up all these new systems and hiring to then build this into something sustainable, right, afterwards. Whereas in the Cataract bond, there is a sustainability target, which is great, but it's more on the onus of the implementer to take that on as a private eye hospital, right, with support from us and the Africa Eye Foundation. But kind of a very different dynamic there. There's a lot more we could dig into, but I know we're short on time, so I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Joe, and thanks, Emily, for joining the discussion. As Joe said, we are running out of time, so apologies for that. We do have a bit more that we'd like to cover. So if you are happy to stay on with us for another 5-10 minutes, that would be great. For the last part of the session, we really wanted to open some of the lessons learned from DIB application, including some lessons from COVID-19. So if I could come back to you, Charlie and Radana, and also Elle, if you could share some general lessons that you've learned from DIBs, and then we'll be hearing from Joe a bit more on some COVID-19 particular aspects. So did you want to come in, Radana and Charlie?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very happy to come in on behalf of FCDO. So I think for us, I mean, anyone who has had a quick look at the report, whether it's the full report or the summary, will see that there's many lessons. So I'm not going to go into all of them because there's so much learning coming out of this report. I think what we are seeing and hearing about DIBs in these reports is really resonating with kind of what we've understood about them from the beginning. There's still kind of a lot of questions around some of the problems or challenges with the model and how that's coming, into play on the ground. But I think what we're doing now, as the FCDO anyway, is really acknowledging those problems and those challenges and trying to use this research to see how we can now move to identify and recommend some solutions moving forward. So what we want to do is apply or take the lessons that we're learning from the DIBs pilot and start to move that into future policy and programs on impact bonds and outcome funds. So I think, for instance, this can help us to, develop some practical tools, some advice, some resources. We know that there's a lot of demand for things like this in terms of how to structure these types of contracts. And I think this particular report is going to be incredibly useful for that, because we can start to see how those design choices are actually coming into play in delivery. And so that should hopefully start to give people an understanding of what they should be looking for at the time of structuring the contract, and in terms of how that's going to then play out later on. And we're definitely building that into our work at the moment, especially in our work around outcomes funds. We've been working very closely with partners like UNICEF, with the World Bank, on developing the first outcomes funds. And I guess our ambition really is to ensure that the contracts that we're developing now will eventually become available and be able to feed that into the wider body of evidence on how to structure an impact bond. And I guess one other thing I just wanted to draw out very quickly before I know we're running out of time is just that one key finding and one recommendation from the report actually was really around the availability of data on impact bonds. And this is one lesson that's coming out, is that with more data available to analyze, we would have a better understanding of, a number of things, including the cost effectiveness of the model. And so really we've taken that, to heart. And as part of that, we're now working very, very closely with GoLab to increase the amount of information available on impact bonds and outcomes funds through the Indigo platform, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of. And really trying to do a lot of work actually directly with the individuals involved in setting up these types of programs to help them engage with the existing evidence like this report and start to really use it well. So from our perspective, that's really how we're taking these lessons forward.
Thanks so much, Charlie. Could I come to you next, Joe? I know that you have some specific experiences around adapting to COVID-19, particularly within the Cataract impact bond. If you wanted to quickly share some of those, and then I'll come to the rest of you for some final takeaways from the session.
Sure, thanks, Tanya. So I think we all have, well, I know we all have dealt with COVID-19 in one way or another. So I think I can share with you a little bit of how that's looked for the Cataract bond. I think in terms of the intervention itself, adaptation, it has meant things have had to change, of course. It's hard to do eye surgery in a socially distanced way and all that. So numbers have understandably had to reduce, but they've added a whole host of new protocols and have been able to continue surgeries almost the entire time during the COVID period, with the caveat that outreach, which is where they get most, almost, or I'd say all of their lower income patients, has had to completely cease. There's been government mandates. You can't have a gathering over 50 people, for example. And they just started resuming that in October with increased cost associated with it. So there's now a big discussion with our steering committee about what are projections, what does this look like going forward in terms of their ability to reach lower income segments of the population. But in terms of the mechanism itself, so I mentioned before, we have year 3 targets that are linked to payments as well as year 5, and we're now coming to the end of year 3. And due to some great foresight and the designers of the bond, we did design a 20% buffer in the volume target in particular for year 3 and a 10% buffer in year 5, specifically with this idea that this is a totally new context. They're building a new eye hospital and it's going to be operating in a completely new place. So there's a lot of external things that could happen. No one foresaw COVID, of course. And because of that buffer, that's allowed them to meet the target without us having to make any adaptations to targets or do any of that yet. But still discussion ongoing for year 5. And I know it's a conversation for another day, but I'd be very interested to hear what everyone else is kind of doing and thinking about in terms of COVID. But those are a few of lessons from our experience.
Thanks so much, Joe. I'd love to sort of draw a little bit to the close. So if I could come to everyone for any final reflections or takeaways, and of course, feel free to mention any bits for the lessons bit that we have not been able to cover. So if I could come to you first, Juan, and then also to you, James and Kay, then to the rest of the panel. So Juan, did you want to go first?
Okay, thanks. Maybe I'll just flag the two points in relation to the first, hopefully not last, humanitarian impact bond, and is this number one. In addition to being important in itself, our humanitarian impact bond was very important for the Icrc to start exploring with much better understanding and skills, innovative finance more generally. Yeah, and again, I think impact bonds need to be situated in the overall spectrum of innovative finance and what it means for particularly for humanitarian actors, which is about solving problems that otherwise wouldn't be solved because humanitarian needs, there are too many, and we need more sectors involved, including development, private, philanthropic, etc. So that's the first point. The second point is that, again, the humanitarian impact bond was focused on our physical rehabilitation program, again, for war amputees and other another type of amputees and women, children, and men with motor disabilities. We're in the process right now of doing a 6-month assessment, taking it from the top, seeing how innovative finance or new financing models, as we'd like to speak of them, can support physical rehabilitation in a strategic way in the long term, bringing in new players into this arena of physical rehabilitation in fragile settings. So what I want to say is that in addition to the impact bond, the humanitarian impact bond being very important for the Icrc in itself, it has opened for us a new field of action around innovative finance. And lastly, we are exploring more options for innovative finance, including impact bonds, to support our physical rehabilitation programs in the long term. So again, thank you very much to all those who supported our impact bond and are on the call now.
Thanks so much, Juan. Did you want to go next, James and Kay? Any particular findings that you want to highlight? After that, I'll come to you, El, Tadeo, and Aaron.
Just to say what I think the key thing that's come from the evaluation is the helpful, bit greater understanding really of what goes on within a DIB and these kind of 4 ingredients around stronger focus on outcomes, heightened performance management, external perspectives and expertise, and high stakes environment. But I think El had a very valid and good response that also there's no fixed checklist. And whilst that gives a nice 30-second summary of what happens in a DIB, each DIB is different. And I would encourage people both to sort of engage with these high-level infographics, but also there are in-depth case studies of each DIB that have been published as well. And they'll give you a sense of some of the detail and variation.
Thanks so much, James. Can I come to you next, El, and then Tadeo and Aaron?
Thank you. 2 quick closing remarks from me, I think. Firstly, to thank the panelists and the research team for their openness and really helping to create this space for learning. I think we're still very much learning how to do impact bonds and how to research them. And so it's great to be doing this together to really understand how to achieve better social outcomes on the ground. And secondly, I've just been thinking of some of the themes from the wider discussion. So I wanted to put out this idea of transaction benefits. We've been talking a lot about the potential additional costs or the additional effort or work that has to go into developing these impact bonds. But I think we're also beginning to see this potential space of trust and strengthened relationships in terms of delivering on these projects. And so I'm looking forward to coming back for part 3, I think, of this research piece to understand what the potential long-term impacts and benefits are from this way of working. Thanks.
Thanks so much, El. Tadeo and then Aaron.
Yeah, thanks. This has been great. I think just say for us, the DIB has really been transformative in terms of just, coming up, having a unified goal, keeping our eyes on the prize in terms of really figuring out what do we need to do to achieve impact. And, just even in addition to that, knowing that we're going to be externally evaluated has really, helped us, also innovate, so trying to really making sure that we're trying to do all we can and being intentional in our work in order to achieve impact in a cost-effective manner. But that being said, I would say that for me, one of the key takeaways would be, especially for organizations, as a lot of you have said here, that well known in the ground, they've already have verifiable impact. Maybe thinking about designs that are more suited, maybe a bit less costly, and also that will not really change the program as much as compared to what it's done. Like, just to give you a good example for us, when we go somewhere in a village, we really want to work with everybody who really qualifies for our program. So trying to come up with the RCT design, making it costly, and also leaving people who, I know that's part of the RCT, but to leaving people who would others be part of our program, then that also becomes a challenge. So thinking about, how do we come up with designs that really do not alter the ethos of our program? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Aaron, finally, over to you.
Thank you. I think it's been very, very interesting discussions and a lot of takeaways from the discussion itself. But now coming back to what I take away from DIB is, the DIB is basically, especially what we look at is the proof of concept. I mean, how do you so strongly depend on your the concept of your concept of change, or the theory of change converted into proof of concept. And when that starts working, and when large section of students or schools are improving their outcomes, I think that gives us a sense of victory. At the same time, it makes us feel that how do we crack this code to scale. So I think this is DIB has been very instrumental in doing sort of a pilot project as a QEI in India, and which is 100 to maybe 500 schools put together. Now with the size of India, I think we need to try DIB, and since we have cracked the code, it's important to take it to scale with quality. And this also invites other NGOs to be part of this collaborative process, so that the same theory of change can be carried forward with a larger partnerships. And that is also a great learning, where we are therefore sharing and the best practices from the DIB to other non-DIB programs. So I see it to be in a way to whatever has been learned can now be taken to a larger scaled up process.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, to our speakers and our participants for your questions and your really helpful insights. And thank you in particular for staying a few extra minutes. Really sorry to run over time. Please do join us next time for our third session, which is on the 17th of March, where we will be looking at learnings from the Icrc Development Impact Bond in India, which is the first impact bond on maternal health. Hope you have a lovely rest of the day, a lovely rest of the week, and thank you so much for joining us. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.